Hey, one of my friends was asking about making wafer paper ranunculus, and you can do the same thing with gum paste for this. And a lot of times when I see ranunculus being made by people, it's really round, but a real ranunculus is, this isn't real, this is made of wafer paper, obviously. A real ranunculus is more flat on the back than that. The buds are round, and then when they open up, they kind of flatten out. And even this is a little on the large side. So here's my hand, there's the flower. And real ranunculus are pretty small. So when I see them being made on, by people online with gum paste and wafer, and it starts with a big round styrofoam ball, that's not right, because it's just not going to look right. And these are actually easier to put on the cake because you don't have to worry about a big ball sticking out from the tier. You can just put these flat up against the tier. So the way to start with these, excuse me, I start with a gum paste center, and you want to kind of flatten it out. This is just a wire with a hook on it with the gum paste in it. Flatten it out so that it's kind of flat on top, and about the size, it's about maybe ½ an inch across, which a couple, I don't even know what that is in centimeters, maybe 2 centimeters, 1.5 centimeters. It's not that big. So that's going to be the center. You want to make this and let it dry. The easiest way to do these is to let them dry in stages, because if you try to do everything wet, it's just going to melt. And it can work, but it's more difficult. So that's the first step. The second step is to do like the very tight bud that will be in the middle of the flower. And to do that, you take the center and put wafer paper petals wrapped around it. And I'll show you how to do that, starting with this one that I made. So this one isn't quite dry yet, obviously. I just said to let it dry, but it's been kind of drying, but it's better to let it dry a little bit more, but not for our purposes today. Now, if you want to, I don't know how people started doing that weird circle thing in the middle of a ranunculus. If you look at the pictures of them online, I don't see anything like that. They might have like they have like a weird little poke kind of center that kind of pokes out like this. So it's like a little point on it. It's kind of strange, but I haven't been able to find a real ranunculus to actually study it because I think they're kind of hard to find. It's a spring flower, and it's not springtime. So you have to take what you can get. So start with this. You can either use small circles or just any kind of 5-petal cutter and punch those out of the paper. And then with vodka, because it dries very fast, paint the center. And then paint the petals just a little bit. And you want to get that wet enough so that it's going to stick. And just wrap those around. This doesn't have to be precise. It doesn't have to be super even because you can always put another layer on. But just start making a little kind of surround the center with these. Now I cut out for these about 4 to 5 of the 5-petal shape. And you can kind of stagger them. I'm just ripping them off. I'm not actually putting the petal on there. If you had a bigger one, this is pretty small. This cutter that I'm using is about maybe 1 inch across. But if you had a larger one, you could slide it up the stem and then just wrap it up like you're doing a quick rose. That would be easy. Oops, and I just made that into glue. Alright, so just wrap these around. And you want to have it so that the middle, the center of it, is showing just a little bit. Vodka, not water. You can use gum glue too, but the gum glue tends to take longer to dry. And that just makes everything take longer overall, so that's not optimal. And your fingers are going to get really sticky while you're doing this because you're touching the wafer paper and the starch is coming off, and it's good to have a paper towel or something, which of course I don't have, so I will wipe it on my pants because that's what jeans are for. When I was in college in art class, in your painting class, you always had paint all down one side of the pants because you would take your paintbrush and just kind of clean your paintbrush off on your jeans. Alright. So once this is pretty much done, you can use as many of these as you want. I used about 4, but you can use more than that if you want to make it a little more covered. And like I said, you can use small circles too. I just used this because I was thinking that it would be easier to have a whole bunch of petals at once. You basically just want to make this covered except for the very center. And once this dries, it's going to be more opaque. So don't worry about it if it looks a little bit too green still. You can also do these with like a brown center, depending on what color you're doing. So it's totally up to you. All right, the second row. Now, actually, I'm going to take this and let this one dry. Make sure you let these dry in between stages because it just makes it easier for you. You can go ahead and do it wet, like I said, but it's just going to make it more complicated because you're going to be messing with the glue while it's still wet. So I'm going to take this one. This one's been drying for about an hour, and it's completely dried now. To show you the next step. All right, so the next step is the rest of the bud. For these, I'm using this cutter, which is just a round circle. A round circle. That's usually what circles are around. It's about 3/4 of an inch across, so it's a little over 1 centimeter. And I haven't cut any kind of little crack in these, like sometimes you cut a slit and then you fold it. But I'm just going to get these completely wet and then wrap them around the center a little bit. So take the center, and you want to keep this pretty close to the surface on the top. And then when you turn it over, you can see the extra. Just pinch that. And that's where the slit would be if you made a cut in it, but you don't really have to do that. Just wet it. If it's wet, it'll press down. All right, so what you want to do is kind of make sure that that stays away. If it's too far down, which I think I just did, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and do the next one. And you want these to kind of stand away from the flower, but not be, you don't want it like this tall over the flower, because that's not how they are. They're very flat. So keep it very close to the top. Make the top of the petal very close to the center. And just do that. And see how, I don't know if you can see that very well, but right here you're starting to get the petal effect instead of just having it be the center. So you're just going to keep going around like that. And ranunculus are very tight. They have very tight petals and a lot of them. So that's the characteristic of this flower that you want to kind of replicate. They're tight and a lot of them, and they're kind of flat. So those three are the three things you should be looking to achieve. All right, so see, this is a little bit out from the, it's standing a little bit out from the center. That's what you want. This one's decided to grab onto it, so I'm just going to pull that out a little bit. And with each petal that you put on, as you go around, you're going to make it a little bit farther out from the side, so that each row stands out just a little bit more and it gives it some shape. Now you might want to not wet the top edge. I'm wetting the whole thing, but when you do that, the tops tend to curl, and it might curl. I think that's what the first petal did that I was looking at. It kind of curled down and grabbed onto the center. So if you don't wet the top edge of the petal, that'll stay dry. The bottom will grab on, and then you start to have something that looks a little more open. See how it's opening up? All right, so once you've done that, and you can use maybe, 6 to 8 petals. It's totally up to you. I've made little notes for myself over here, so I remember how many I cut. I could go ahead and do another row if I felt like it, but I don't feel like it because I know these are going to make up for some of that. Now on this next row, it's going to be the cupped kind of outer edge of the bud, and these petals are also going to be level with the top, but they're more open. So what I did for these, I cut about 20 of the same size circle, but I cut a little slit in these. And for these I'm going to just, let's see, I want the smooth side up. It doesn't really matter, because this kind of flower, you don't really see the texture of the paper. You're just going to cup it where the slit is and stick it to itself. Wet the petal, and then go and try to start sticking it along the side, and that's going to open it up. Like right here, it's going to be more open. It's going to be a little bit farther away. I don't want it that far away. I still want it to be tighter, so just press that closer to the base and just keep going around. And this takes a while. It's not like it's not a super fast process, but there are just so many petals on these flowers, you can't really rush it. Now for this row, I am avoiding getting the top of the petal wet. I'm only really wetting the bottom where the slit on the flower is, and then I'm wetting the petal again, and I'm going to stick it on here. But the top should stay dry so that it keeps the shape right here when you put it on the petal. The bottom will stick, the top will stay dry, and right now we're starting to get the opening shape of the flower. You can start to see it. And if you're doing the inner part and it takes like 30 petals because they just keep dissolving and sticking to the center, that's fine. You want to try for that not to happen because it'll just take you longer. But sometimes you can't help it. Because wafer paper, when it gets sticky, it just sticks to anything that it grabs. So it's hard to unstick it once it's done. Okay, so you're going to keep going around like that. And like I said, I did 20 to 25 petals. When I'm done with that, it looks more like this. And see, it's still not tremendously open, but it's getting there. And the petals here are a little bit higher because it starts out like a bud and then it opens up. So if it starts out like this with all the petals, it's going to open up, so they're going to go up a little bit and then fall back down. So these are the ones that are up a little bit as they're opening up. Now we're going to do the ones that are falling back down. And that's where you get the flat shape of the flower. So for the center petals, which would be like, okay, this is what I'm holding in my hand right now. This is what we're doing right now, kind of this middle area. So you want them to be a little bit farther out in terms of falling away from the center. You don't want them to be standing up, curling around it as much as this, but you don't want them to be this far out. So I'm going to use the same shape, and the same size, I mean, and I'm not going to cut any kind of slit in these. It's just a plain circle, and I'm just going to go and start sticking them to the outside of the flower. And I was wondering, why isn't that sticking? It's because this is the one that I've been let drying. When you get to the point where you're done with the center part, let that dry. Just do a whole bunch and let them dry in between stages. It just makes your life easier. All right, so again, I'm not wetting the top portion, just the bottom. Just hold it in place for a second. It will stick there, and you're just going to keep going around like that. And ranunculus do have a lot of petals. For this section, I cut 30 of these. You can use up to 40, totally up to you how thick you want it. But these flowers really they're a lot of petals, but they're very small. They're not a huge flower, and they're not really rounded. So you want to keep it flat and really compact. It's a very compact flower. Alright, so just keep going around in a spiral. Hold it for a second. If it won't stick, just kind of brush the back like that. And at this point, you're kind of working down. You see, you can still see the back of the gum paste there where it goes into the wire. You're starting to work down so that you're going to cover this whole back section all the way up to the wire with the wafer paper. And that'll also help to keep it stuck to the wire. And if it looks like it's a little uneven on one side and you just need a little bit more filler there, don't be afraid to get away from the order of it and just go ahead and put another one there. You can just kind of wipe the vodka on the flower itself, but that will, that really tends to get it soaking wet, so you don't want to do that too much. Sometimes it's so wet, I can feel it's really wet here. I might just be able to stick this here without even, I can stick that there without even wiping the petal with the brush. So that's convenient. Okay, see, at this point I'm getting down toward the base. So when I'm adding the petals, it's going closer to the base of the wire, and I'm just pressing right there. And you just want to watch on the top to make sure that you're not getting too open too fast. But as you do this row, you're going to get to the point where the wire is completely being covered by the petals. And before you do this, go to Google and just do a Google search for images of real ranunculus. I'm sorry, I'm trying to hold this so you can see it, but you really need to look at the real flower before you start making flowers. The problem that I see with a lot of people they run into is that they'll look at pictures of flowers that other people have made out of gum paste, and if one person makes a mistake or does a fantasy flower, which is acceptable, but not if you're trying to, actually make a real looking flower. If you're copying someone's fantasy flower, then it's going to be even more of a fantasy than theirs was. And by the time you're done, you end up with something that doesn't look at all like the flower you're trying to make. So look at the real thing. If you actually have a chance to get the real flower, then do that. That's the best way. And sometimes you can just take a flower and pull it apart. And it feels so violent. But it's the best way to do it because then you can see what the actual shape of the petals are. And you'll be surprised when you take flowers apart how different they actually are from the cutters that we can get to make these kinds of things. They're either a lot smaller or the shapes are different. And it just helps you to see how they're put together if you can pull them apart every now and then. Alright, so you basically just keep doing this all the way around, and you're trying to make it a little bit farther out each time. Overlap the petals, just keep going, and eventually you'll get to a point where it's, this full, and you're just going to keep working to build the petals out. Once it gets to this point where it's kind of covering that, then you can start bringing them farther out so that they're attached to each other. Like instead of putting it all the way down, I'm putting it on the petal. So really the base of this one is only coming to about here. It's not all the way down here. But I want to make it farther out here, so that's how it's going to go. And if you have a bigger cutter than this, you can use that. I just have these 3 cutters. I've got a 3/4 inch, one that's about 1.5, and one that's about 2. And the 2-inch one is really quite large for this particular purpose. Now you see how this is starting to fall away? I don't like that because when you look at the flower it gives a big section over here that's kind of gappy. So I'm just going to wet that and press it up a little bit. And if that starts to happen a lot, you might want to just wait and let this section dry before you keep adding more petals to it. And since this one is sticking up, oh look, it's paper, I'll just cut it off. No problem. Alright, so just remember that you can trim things if it's not to your liking once you look at it. Alright, so you're just going to keep working out there until you're happy with the size of this. And then the next step is to move up to a slightly larger circle. This is the 1.5 inch, so it's a little more than slightly larger. But that's the size that I have, so I'm working with what I have. You can also use rose petal cutters for this if you have a punch that will punch out rose petals. That'll work. And that one is going to cover the wire. See, so I'm wrapping that around the wire, and it's extending past the edge of the petal, so that's perfect. For this bunch of petals, I would do maybe 20 to 25, I have written down. That's just an estimate. If 10 will work for you and you like the way it looks, just do 10. And see, I really needed to let this dry before I started this row because it's really sticky. So this is going to wrap around the wire a little bit, kind of secure that, and extend past there. And it's important to secure this to the wire because if the gum paste lets loose and the wire falls out, that's not good. Okay, around the wire, make sure it's extending out here. Okay, so you see how that's starting to take shape. You're going to keep going with that. If you want to, when you get to the end, you can do a larger petal, but these are big, and if you do that, the flower's going to be a lot bigger than a real ranunculus. If that's a look you're going for, that's perfect, but it's really not necessary. Now the key to doing a ranunculus that looks real is to do the layers, a lot of them in flat, but then when you get to the final row of these, you want to curl them down just a little bit. So just wet the edge very slightly and curl them down. You can also take Crisco or any other kind of shortening and do that. Because what happens with the ranunculus is, like I said, it's a ball of petals to begin with, and as it opens up, the petals fall out. And the reason that these look round is that they're either the bud or the final flower has opened up enough that the petals are falling down like that, and it gives it the illusion of having more petals under here than there actually are. So you can see on this flower that I finished, I have taken like this outer petal here. It started out here, but I bent it down. And you know, it might be better to use Crisco because that'll soften the paper, but it won't make it sticky. And you can just take it and manipulate it until it's folded down like that, but it's not going to stick to the other petals as you're working on it. So up to this point, they are flat, all in line. And then when you get to this point, at the very last row, start to bend a few of them down, like they're sagging, they're coming away, and that's what makes it get the look of the actual flower. And then to cover it up, I just took a little, it looks like a star kind of flower, and put a green stamen on it. And that's really it. So just remember the goals that you want are to keep the flower mainly flat. You want to bend these out and have a lot of petals, all very tightly coiled, basically. So just coil them around the center. Make sure that you dry each step in between stages so that you don't end up like wrestling with a wet piece of gum paste and wet wafer paper, because that will be really unpleasant. And that's about it. If you have any questions, post them, and I'll try to answer. Oh, and this plastic that I got, I think you can get this at Nicolas Cage's shop. I bought this on Etsy. All it is it's like a green plastic tube, and you can slide it up the stems of flowers that have a thicker stem. So this is a piece of wire in here, but I've just slid this up over it. And it just gives it a more realistic look when it's in an arrangement. But if you're going to put this on a cake, you don't need this. You just, put that right into the cake. And that's it. So like I said, post any questions, and I'll try to get to them as soon as I can.